Stories, not stuff. How to create a fulfilling bucket list that truly matters. Join the Bucketlist Accountant himself, David Patterson, as we discuss the importance of creating a bucket list that prioritises experiences over possessions. Learn how to shift your focus from accumulating stuff to creating meaningful stories and memories that bring true fulfillment. You'll gain some actionable strategies to help you create a bucket list that aligns with your values and goals, and discover how to make those experiences a reality. This episode equips business leaders with the insights needed to live a life that is full of purpose and meaning. I'm your host, Anthony Pearl. Let's get into making your bucket list happen.
David, when we sat down and talked about what are we going to talk about in this podcast, and you came back to me and you said, stories, not stuff. I love this heading, and I think it's a great way of talking about the bucket list. So let's get into it. Stories, not stuff. Give me your definition of what the difference is.
It was a UK website, but that's as close as I can get. I haven't narrowed it down very much for people, but in the background on their homepage, there was a little picture at the bottom that had the words stories, not stuff written on it. And I just looked at it and went, it kind of encapsulates everything that I'm doing. And it equated to our experience. So I was traveling overseas for a couple of years in my early 20s, which is a few years ago from today. And we're over there for nearly 2 years, traveling and just enjoying ourselves as in our early 20s. But the thing I've come to realise now, 30 years later, is the memories and the stories that I've got from that time are with me still. So if I have a chat to someone and they're heading off to Italy, a memory and a story will come back to me of one in particular that just popped in then was a 4 cheeses pizza that my wife and I had in Italy at Pompeii. Best pizza I've ever had in my life, and that's 30 years ago, and it just keeps popping up. And I could go on and on and on with stories from back then, but I can't remember anything that I owned back then. So I think from that perspective, and don't get me wrong, stuff's important. You need stuff, but you don't need stuff as much as people think that they need stuff. You need cars to get around, but you don't need the biggest and the best and the newest. The house, it's nice to live in a nice house and be comfortable, but you don't need to live in a massive house. And you're not going to be thankful for the massive house or the brand new cars you had at the end of the day. You're going to be very thankful and happy for the memories you have. And again, I'll go back to me. I remember as a kid going and visiting my grandmother, and she took a trip overseas to Singapore. We were only, I can't remember what age, but it was back in the days of slides. So she would do a slideshow when we went to visit her and tell us all these stories about the things she got up to in Singapore. And we heard those stories year after year after year, but it was fantastic. And I think the more of those that you can make and the earlier that you can make them, the longer they last. And I think for me, and this is what I'm passing, the more enriching I think your life becomes.
Yes, it's really an interesting idea of that stories, not stuff, because I even think about the concept that you are, going back to your story about the pizza, right? Question is, did you pause, take photos of the pizza? How often do you go back and look at the photos? Because that's the stuff as well, right? Isn't it? A lot of that represents all of those things.
In fairness on that one, Anthony, back when we did it, we were still using 36 and 24 rolls of film. And so we were very careful on the photos that we took. You're right, though. If we had the time over again, we would have taken half a dozen photos of that pizza. Probably never looked at it again. And we wouldn't show someone a picture of that pizza if we were talking to them. But we, both my wife and I, could describe in great detail. Since then, we've only had one 4 cheeses pizza that has come anywhere near close to how good that was.
There is a TV show or a book or something in this, David. Traveling the world, the 4 cheeses pizza. It might not be too healthy going all around the world trying it, but it'd be a heck of a lot of fun.
I think one of the things that struck me, it's hard to imagine how good a pizza that's only got 4 different types of cheese on it can be. Move on from the pizza, but I think it's a really good example of the memories and stories you can create.
Yeah, and I think it is what's really important, isn't it? And we talk about this in relation to the bucket list, if we bring it back to that and saying that what is going to be on your list that is going to create those stories and those memories that you're going to hold dear versus the stuff.
Yep.
Because we do get focused a lot on the stuff, don't we? I mean, we've been sold in this technology climate that my phone is 2 years old. I better go and buy a new phone because the new phones have got 10 cameras and I've only got 5 and I better get it. And in fact, that I'll never use 9 of the cameras, but that's kind of the cyclical nature that we've been built into, that we are focused on that. And that's been a very clever shift by a lot of businesses that don't make things to last. and get us focused on the little improvements. I often talk about the fact that using that example of the phone and saying, quite frankly, if a company wanted to make the back of a phone just a gazillion cameras or one big camera, I bet you they could do it today. But mentally, we're not ready for that leap yet.
No.
They have to make incremental leap. So it makes sense. We want to keep boosting the technology. So they keep doing it. That some of the marketing that is great with a lot of things where, oh, it now comes with this. You don't even know if that thing actually makes any real difference, but we get sold into that stuff.
No.
Rather than putting the money into the things that are going to create the stories.
Yes. And you're right. We get caught up in, like, we must have this or we must have that because that's what's sold to us. And the other element of it is that your neighbour's got one or your best friend's got one, or there's a bit of internal pressure that builds about having all this stuff because everyone else has got the stuff. And everyone else has got the stuff because from their perspective, everyone else has got the stuff. So it's a race that you're never going to win. And ultimately, it doesn't create any longer term happiness or satisfaction, I don't think. As long as you've got a nice house, it's comfortable, it protects you from the elements, it helps you to raise your family. Do you need the fourth bathroom? I don't think you do. I think it's more important to be using that money or even time that you create by getting your business more efficient so that you don't have to be there as often. I think it's more important to spend that time with your family, your friends, and just sitting down and talking to one another and creating good times and having that pass on. Because I know my kids are a bit older now, 23 and 20, and I know for a fact that things that we did with them when they were kids, they remember and enjoy and look back on fondly. So it's not just the memories that you're creating, but it's the stuff that you're passing on as well that I think is ultra important.
Yeah, and I think there is a balance, isn't there? Because sometimes the stuff can be things that create the stories. So went out and bought a 4-wheel drive so we could go out camping and driving and whatever else.
Oh, absolutely.
So there is definitely some merit in stuff. It's not like advocating we surrender all stuff.
Please don't get rid of all the stuff. Keep stuff. Stuff is good, but I think it doesn't have to be the overriding driver of what you're doing and why you're doing it. But you're right, the 4-wheel drive so you can go camping. But again, like you say, while you're there camping, you don't reflect back on the fact that the brand new Land Cruiser got us there. It's the fact that you were there camping and sitting around the fire and toasting marshmallows and that kind of thing. That's what you remember.
This podcast is brought to you by bucketlistaccounting.com.au. Speak to David Patterson and his team if you want to take better control of your life and business, helping small business owners like you be successful designing the life of your dreams. Go to bucketlistaccounting.com.au or check out the show notes for more information. Now back to the program.
Of course, the car companies will make you think otherwise and that's how the advertising works, right? That's exactly the image that they put the car front and center in that.
Absolutely.
But the truth is most people don't remember the vehicle as much. There might be one or two little circumstances where the vehicle plays a part in the story, but more often than not, it becomes irrelevant. It's just another one of those things that is the stuff, but it's what we get fed into all the time. I mean, we talk about the fact in marketing, 90% of decision-making process is emotional and the 10% is justifying the emotion.
Yes.
And when you look at that, you get fed into those things and it's very difficult to break out of that cycle and get some reality. If we bring it back to the bucket list and getting that reality in the bucket list and saying, well, what are going to be the story makers?
Yeah, I think that's why it's important to start to think about your bucket list as early as you possibly can and getting a feel for the things that you want to do and the things that are important to you. Because the earlier you can do that, then the clearer it becomes of the things that are really important to you, and that the stuff becomes the vehicle to achieve their stories rather than the other way around. So I think it becomes really important to get a feel for that early on. And not a lot of people, common answer to the question is what's on your bucket list is, I don't know. They've got things, but they don't know what those things are, which makes it really hard to then achieve those things because they're floating around somewhere, but you don't really have a good grip of what they are. So it's hard to then achieve them. So the earlier you can get your bucket list down from a family perspective as well as your own perspective, I think the quicker you'll come to that understanding and realization that the things you have, the possessions you have, and some of those possessions that you thought were really, really important don't become as important anymore. And that the things that you do and the stories that you make and the memories you create, I think they become the important parts of what you're doing.
Yeah, the stories are so important. So let me ask you the question then. You've worked with many people over a number of years and you've talked through bucket lists and things. I'm guessing that what you remember more are the stories that are around, even when they've bought stuff, that it's the stories around it that's more important than necessarily the stuff itself. And that's where the highlights of the bucket list have been.
Oh, 100%. So one in particular that combines stuff, but it was an important stuff, was one client who'd always wanted a certain type of motorbike, expensive motorbike, but always wanted this certain type of motorbike, but always felt guilty about going to buy it because he thought there's so many other things that he needed to be doing. So we worked through the process and found out how much it was going to cost and all that type of thing. And I said, right, is your house getting paid off? Yes, my house is getting paid off. Putting food on the table, you're doing all this, you're doing all that. Has your business got enough money? All of that aside, can you afford the bike? Yes, I can afford the bike. Go and get the bike. So he actually took a photo with him there in the dealership getting the bike, and he sent it to me as a message. And to me, that's the stuff that really lights me up, is the fact that they're sending the pictures of the motorbike. They're sending the pictures from when they're on holidays. It's creating stories for them, but it's creating memories and stories for me too, because in a small way, we've helped them get the things that they wanted to get.
Yeah, I think it's such an important idea of being able to focus on those things. And how easy is it, though, when you're sitting down with people and talking to them about creating their bucket list, to actually go focus on those things that are going to create the stories?
I mean, it's a bit of a process, because the reality of it is that it's not been made much of a focus on for them by anyone. So firstly, it's not been much of a focus for them to work out what it is they want to do, what is on their bucket list. Well, there's two other elements. Secondly, that they haven't thought about the memories that they're going to create and the stories that they're going to be writing. And three is overcoming the guilt factor that they have about spoiling themselves, rewarding themselves for the hard work that they've done. Once they can get past those areas and really focus on the things that they want to do, kind of really becomes much easier and a lot more fun.
Absolutely. So give me a couple more of your favorite stories about stories makers from the bucket list. Holidays, obviously the common example, but I think that there are lots of other things out there that people do, and some of them, they don't necessarily have to be big ticket items either.
Not at all. There's people that have always wanted to learn to cook. It's a small thing, but they suddenly take an afternoon off work or an afternoon away from their business, and they go off and do it and have an absolute great time. And then they cook meals at home and things that they would never have done in the past. A client the other day came in and she wants to learn to play the cello. I've never had anyone come in and say they want to play the cello. And it's the fact that they're now talking to me about those things, whereas in years gone by before we were doing this, I would never have learned that this person wanted to learn to play the cello, or I would never have learned that this other person wanted to cook, or any of those things. So it's, without being specific on real stories, for me, that's the real win there, is creating that relationship where they're wanting to tell me about all these things that they want to do. And the realization, I guess, too, that I Googled cello teachers and sent this person a list of teachers. There's not a lot close to here, surprisingly, but at least she's now got a list of teachers in the area that she can go to learn to play the cello.
Such a great story. And what's really interesting, we started this discussion about stuff and stories, and what we've talked about all the way through really is the stories. And even the one little example you gave just before the cello was that, to take an afternoon off a week to go and do a cooking class. What the most powerful thing about that is actually being able to take the half a day off of work. That's a really powerful part of that story. And that's the memories that you create from doing that. And I think about as well, and I'm sure we all can, of presents that we've received over the years. And you get things that are stuff, whatever that is, from clothing to something more lavish and larger, that's fine. It sparked a memory for me when you were talking about that. One of the presents that I got given a few years ago from the family was to go and do a couple of cooking classes, something that I would never normally have done. And that, sits high in my memories, and some great stories around what I was able to experience, more so than the various amounts of stuff that you get given over the years.
Well, just on that, one of the better gifts that I've received over the last couple of years, which was, I think, last Christmas, was a record player. And it allowed us to get out all the old records that I had as a kid and records from my mum and dad, and be able to sit down and play them and remember playing them when we were kids. And things pop up into your head about, remember the time but just the beautiful nature of putting a record on and playing it, and just that old style of listening to music. It was wonderful.
I think that's the great thing, to finish up on this discussion, is really music is an amazing thing, because buying the record is stuff, but it's not stuff in the same way, because it's not an expensive piece of stuff. But what it does is it contains stories. That's what music ultimately is about. And you have memories that are attached to those. Similar to my daughter bought herself a record player and I gave her some of those records, and I've still got memories attached to the first 1 or 2 records that I wouldn't say I bought. I asked for, demanded as a, whatever I was, 8 or 9-year-old child.
Yep.
The first records, and some of them still create some memories and amusement that go with it. And so I think that is a really powerful lesson for people to think about as we talk about the bucket list. That's what the show's about. And it's about creating and the possibilities of that, but to make sure that when you're doing it, you're creating those things that don't just get focused on the stuff. Get focused on the things that are going to create the stories that have a real impact on your life, the lives of those around you.
Absolutely. Well said.
The Bucketlist Accountant podcast is brought to you by David Patterson and his team at Bucketlist Accountant. Go and visit their website for more information, details of course in the show notes. I'm Anthony Pearl, your host from Podcast Done For You. We look forward to having your company in the next episode.